inviting me. I think the last time I spoke here, I was still in government and spoke on the same topic, but I think I had to be much more restrained. So today I can speak my mind more freely. So let me just begin by saying that I hope, given where the state of Pakistan, not governments come and go, but the state of Pakistan got to in December or January in terms of national security through its national security policy, will now be what we internalize as our own definition and our own sort of focus when it comes to national security, which is the term that we used at that time was comprehensive national security. The point being that we can't look at national security from any narrow prism. It has to be a conversation that includes the broadest facets of national security. And so, if I were to start this conversation, the very first thing I'd do is remind all of us on what that conception of national security is. The principal goal of national security, as defined there, was the welfare of the average citizen of Pakistan. So it's a very citizen-centric approach to what national security means. We can be the richest country in the world and the securest country in the world physically, but if our average citizen is not physically secure, does not have a secure livelihood, and believes that their dignity is not guaranteed, we're a very insecure nation and society, even if we are a secure state. That's fundamentally what we've tried to approach and question when we sort of worked on the national security policy and, frankly, other processes that governments before the previous one, and I'm sure this one, would be considering. What is the tool to achieve this citizen-centric national security vision? And there, the front and center of the conversation, the fulcrum of national security going forward has to be economic security. And the idea behind that simply is that Pakistan as a country does not have enough resources to adequately fund human security and its traditional security aspects. So military, law enforcement, foreign policy, etc. You know, I personally talked a lot about geoeconomics as a shift from geostrategy to geoeconomics. And it was grossly misunderstood because one of the critiques was, well, you're giving up on geostrategy. In fact, if you look at literature on geostrategy, geopolitics, and geoeconomics, they're the same thing. It's just two sides of the same coin. And the question is, what emphasis you're putting on which, and what approach you are taking to a problem. So are you thinking of a problem in hard security terms? i.e., if there's a problem on your border, is your first reaction to shut down and close the border? Or is the first reaction to ensure that whatever commercial activity is happening continues while you plug the gap in whatever physical security concerns you have? That's it. That's all there is to it when it comes to geoeconomics versus geostrategy. In terms of national security and this conception, the starting point has to be to know that we are in a place which is extremely difficult. We are facing multiple compound challenges in virtually every stream of national security. So let's look at economic security. We talk about geoeconomics, and the pillars of geoeconomics for Pakistan as defined are connectivity, regional connectivity, and building strong development partnerships with the world, which means what? Countries and private sectors come and invest in Pakistan, buy from Pakistan, right? Essentially, that's where you get resources. Because I'll repeat, fundamentally, very simply put, the problem is we don't earn enough foreign exchange. So we don't have enough money to go around and satisfy both human security and traditional security aspects. So in terms of geoeconomics, connectivity and development partnerships, just look around. Connectivity. We've got two Western neighbors that are internationally sanctioned and isolated. We've got an Eastern neighbor with which we've had no relationship practically for some time now. And then we've got China, of course, where CPEC, and we've done fairly well in terms of that connectivity, which is north-south and is building. We've invested a lot of time as a state in Central Asia, because we think that is, and rightly so, that is an avenue that is underexplored and we can explore further. But the problem is, unless we can use Afghan territory for that transit in a secure manner, you can't get to Central Asia. It's a fairly challenged environment. In terms of development partnerships, unfortunately, the scope is fairly limited right now, given where Pakistan's investment climate is, and perhaps a far bigger problem that for a country of our size, we simply don't produce enough to sell. Right? We keep debating on which sector is doing better, which sector is doing worse. The real problem is that the sum total of productivity is not even 30% of where it should be for a country of our size, potential, and resources. Right? So it's a fairly challenged environment if my goal is to enhance economic security by getting more resources. The other part on the economy, I'll say, and I'm no economist, but frankly, there are many others, even in this audience, who know this better. But I think we also need to start understanding how the economy functions and how the economy grows, and why wealth creation is not a crime as long as it's done legally. For the past 5-6 months, we've been talking about the IMF. IMF coming, IMF going, IMF, we're getting IMF, we're not getting IMF. It was critical to get IMF. There's no question about it. But IMF is not economic growth. IMF is simply making sure that the patient is not on the ventilator. Right? That's just the starting point to survive. I also kept hearing that once the IMF deal is through, the rupee will stabilize, bond markets will open up, etc. That was never the case. But we keep talking about the economy as if we've got a formula that is unique in the world and somehow we'll manage it when others haven't. There is no shortcut to fixing the economy. It can only happen if we generate more resources in terms of increasing productivity, production, exports, and FDI. So fairly challenged on the economic security piece. Then you come to human security. And I don't think one needs to say anything more than the fact that the floods have caused the kind of disaster that they have and the kind of havoc they've played in Pakistan, unfortunately. But the question we have to ask ourselves, frankly, is what is the natural disaster in this episode? I've struggled to figure that out. It's a disaster, there's no question about it. But there was no earthquake, there was no volcano eruption, there was no glacier meltdown which was not predicted. All that happened was that it rained too much, which will, by the way, now continue happening given where climate change and global warming and everything else is going. There are predictive analyses going back 20 years, which told us exactly what's going to happen. So what we really need to say is we were not prepared. We messed up somewhere as a country. We didn't invest in things that we needed to invest in. But let's not absolve ourselves as a collective society by saying this is a natural disaster. This was an entirely preventable disaster. But in terms of human security, the fundamental problem that at least we identified when I worked on this, which remains true today and was true unfortunately 20 years ago, is twofold. We have no office, no individual, no space which is tasked to do long-term strategic planning on human security. So if I were to ask you right now, who is responsible for making sure that we have long-term planning and preparedness for the next floods? Many of you have lived your entire lives in government or in the public sector. Can anybody tell me which institution is singularly responsible for doing that? So if we don't have accountability based on who's going to deliver, the results are going to be obvious. So the first thing is we don't have long-term strategic thinking and planning on human security anywhere. The provinces do their own thing. The federal government does their own thing. One ministry will do something, but there is no coordination, no collation, no big picture. The second big problem is that in terms of human security, we haven't identified a judicious model of redistribution of resources. One between haves and have-nots, but far more important in terms of national security, not to sort of undermine the importance of the first, is distribution to geographically underdeveloped areas. I remember doing an analysis and looking at this aspect. There is almost 100% correlation between resentment towards the state and level of development of a peripheral area in Pakistan. So the more the gap between the developed and the underdeveloped regions, the greater the resentment and the greater the possibility of that turning into some kind of revolt or violence or anti-state activity. Right? So on the economic security side, structural constraints. On the human security side, we don't have a model that redistributes. And you know, it's very interesting. It's colloquial, it's anecdotal. A lot of people talk about it. But has anybody thought through deeply on why many people today are saying that, you know, we're saying the economy is near default, it's collapsing, things are really bad. But when you go around Lahore, Karachi, Islamabad and look at the buzz and look at the elite restaurants, how is it that they're full and everything is working perfectly fine? Has anybody given this deeper thought on what the reasoning is? Because on the one hand, we are getting data that petrol consumption is down significantly. So people are actually cutting down on costs. It's pinching many. But then the elite structures seem to be functioning just fine. So what's happening? This is that part of the elite informal economy where resources are actually available to individuals but are not being transferred back to the state. Right? So rich people, poor society. That's fundamentally the conundrum that we face. Economic security, where we have to move, we are badly challenged, and human security, the distribution part, has not really worked. So where do we go? I think that's the most important question. And let me just say what I think may be the way forward, but I'd love to be challenged on that. So number one, again, many people here have much more experience of government and the public sector. But in my reckoning, one of the problems that I have always felt in terms of our policy making structures is that we are not good at prioritizing. We have a fairly weak capacity, if you will, in terms of public sector delivery. across the board, but we are trying to do too many things at the same time, thus losing out on what key priority sectors or issues should be for the country. So in my view, if I were to look at economic security, there are only two things that I would focus on. Everything else has to happen. I'm not saying we give that up, but if I were to identify two things which are very difficult, but where I would go. Number one, there is a very simple but complex puzzle that we face. Pakistan earns, give or take, $65 billion in non-debt raising foreign exchange, which means exports, FDI, and manpower exports, so remittances. Right? It's about 60, 65, 68, depending on which year you're talking about. If you get to about 95 to 100, you start getting the breathing room that you need, and you can sustain your current levels of debt and expenditures and everything else. The back of the envelope, but we can debate the number, but somewhere there. The puzzle that all policymakers should focus on with their eyes closed is, how do we bridge this gap of 30 billion? That's it. It's just one question that we need to answer. And there are only three avenues: exports, remittances, and FDI. So if we were to focus on this particular aspect, on how to get to 30 billion, let's say in 5 years, I'm not saying it's easy, but if that's the direction we take, you will find much of the debates about who gets too much money, who gets too little money, how do we do this, they will start receding, because the pie, the size of the national resource pie would be larger, and there'll be more money then to go around and distribute. Then will come the real question of whether we can distribute it judiciously or not. But right now the problem is, we need 200 rupees, we have 100 rupees, and everybody's fighting for that. And if you already have societal fault lines, it will always be played up politically, and you will start creating more wedges in society because of that. So that's puzzle number one. Puzzle number two is, when and how will we able to stop the bleeding from our state-owned enterprises? These two ultimately are basically the resource drags on our economy. I'm not saying taxation is not important, revenue, all of that is true. But I think the fountain has to be first fixed, which is you're not getting enough in. So the water you're putting out is always going to be challenged, right? And these are two areas where we have simply not managed to perform the way we need to. I mean, every year, I think we put a certain number, billions of dollars, showing revenue from privatization proceeds. But if you look at the track record of privatization, we just haven't done it. Simple as that. And we don't know how to turn around these SOEs. So the number that is attached to that yearly bleeding is just unbelievably high for a country like Pakistan. So in economic security, if you can start fixing this part, then I think there will be easier times in terms of distribution and figuring out the human security aspect that I mentioned in terms of distributing judiciously. The second part that I would focus on, and this is not really in our control, frankly, but essential, is connectivity, right? And I think the only avenue open to us at this point is Central Asia through Afghanistan. And again, not easy, whatever, I mean, I know how difficult it is, trust me, but whatever we can do to think about that space, I think is going to be crucial. The next part of this that I would put to you is a question which I think requires a very bold answer if we are to move in this direction of economic security, which again, I will repeat, the goal of economic security is not an end unto itself. is to have more resources for human security and more resources for traditional security. I want to keep repeating this argument that traditional security has too much money and others don't. Maybe true in relative terms. The fact is that even our traditional security is under-resourced, given the challenges that we face. So everybody needs more money, but you have to first get those resources. So the next point that I wanted to mention in terms of where we need a bold decision is, are the institutional structures that we use and the institutional capacities that we use, are they tailored to achieving what I've just explained? So I'll give you one very simple example. And in the presence of distinguished and decorated ambassadors, this is never a good thing. But if you want to move in this direction, Pakistan's foreign policy has to gradually repivot towards economic diplomacy. That has to become the centerpiece and the cornerstone of diplomacy, while all other traditional areas of foreign policy continue to be pursued. This by no means is implying that you give up on things that you were doing. But are we geared towards, as a country, as a state, as officials, to promote economic diplomacy as the cornerstone of our engagement with the world? Are we trained to do that? Do we put resources to that? Let me also put another provocative question. Are the various departments, functionaries, ministries who are responsible for that aligned, coordinated, and synergized to do that? I think those who worked in this system would know better, but I would reckon not. In fact, I think we are very far from where we need to be. And if that's true, who is going to break the status quo, move beyond the institutional turf, and reorient the processes through which we approach the world? Because right now, let's be honest, I was reading this morning, I think maybe it was somebody, a government functionary, had said that even friendly countries don't want to listen to us anymore when we ask for assistance. I think that's a true statement. But we have to ask ourselves, why is that a true statement? It is a true statement because we have approached the world either in terms of hard security asks and geopolitics, or through aid diplomacy. We've never done development diplomacy. We don't train our people to do development diplomacy. So I think the question here is, it's not a question of potential, by the way. It's not a question of what Pakistan does or doesn't do. This part is about reorienting the institutional ethos so that a whole of nation and whole of government approach is focused on economic security to benefit human security and traditional security. That's the conception of national security that every Pakistani should walk with every day. Next, in terms of institutional reorientation, and I don't think we've even started thinking about this part. If we are talking economic security, you can't create a holistic approach to the world without synergizing your federal government's approach with the approach of the provinces. After the 18th Amendment, the provinces actually have the right to deal with the outside world directly. They can go and raise foreign direct investment without the federal government. Right? How are we going to bring this provincial federal synergy together so that we are moving in a direction where there is a holistic approach and the world is actually responding positively? So provinces' role in national security comprehensively defined is another question we have to ask and answer as we move forward. Third, and I think this is absolutely critical, the way the structures of the Pakistani economy are set up, And there's tons of homework that's been done inside the government. So it's not that we don't know. And the sectors that are identified as potentially being able to leapfrog us to bridge that $30 billion gap, none of them can take off unless the public sector moves from a regulatory mindset to a mindset of facilitating the private sector. All those sectors are going to be private sector led growth. None of them the public sector can lead. Just the way it's structured, they just simply, the public sector has no role in leading them, should not have a role in leading them. But moving from regulation to facilitation, I think, is probably the toughest thing for the kind of environment we have created. How that's going to happen, I don't know. But in my 2.5 years in government, every day I tried to understand why we regulate. I could never get a straight answer, except that we continue to regulate. And of course, I'm not saying that governments don't regulate, but the point is, the mindset has to be facilitation, not regulate. If the private sector is not allowed to lead growth in the sectors that are identified, we will not get optimal outcomes. And finally, why not end on the most provocative point? I think there is a prerequisite to all of what I've said. Without policy consensus from which will be derived policy continuity, all of this is useless. You can't have policies for a year, 2 years, and 3 years, and then whimsically move in a completely different direction. And that's been our 70 years of history, by the way. None of what I'm saying here, I want to be clear, is about any particular actor, entity, government. And we really need to get back into the mindset of thinking about Pakistan. At the end of the day, that's the only thing that matters. So policy continuity, which will come only through a policy consensus, which is only possible if there's political stability. Without that, we cannot have policies that last, investors that have confidence, exports that can grow, a military that can defend all the time, and the average citizen that can get their livelihood. Right? And in Pakistan's case, I am actually completely sold to this. I understand it's very provocative, but all institutions need to be supporting each other to get to whatever we need to go. And the reason is that no single entity has the capacity to do what is required. So across the board, the conversation has to be constructive, healthy, positive, and everybody, anywhere who can play a role, must play a role. So that's essentially, if you want to talk about, at least as I see it, national security and the conception of national security, this is where I would go. The final thing I'd say to you, and especially to the youngsters in the audience, since I've been out of government, I've engaged with many more people, thankfully, who speak their mind and challenge and question. And I have found a very disturbing trend among many of our youngsters, which is that they're beginning to question whether we are going to be okay. I've sensed distress, sometimes despondence. That is criminal on your part, because this country depends on you. We've done what we had to do, right? And there, I think I would only encourage you by saying that what I have said today here in the past 30 minutes would never have been the conversation on national security a few years back. So things do change. Things have changed. Things will continue to change, but things will not change if all of you sit around and tell me what the problem is. I've created the problem for you. I know the problem. You have to solve that problem. And so there is no dearth of potential in this country. There's no dearth of good people. Yes, our systems have decayed over time. Those are what we need to focus on. We need to prioritize, focus on the areas that I mentioned as far as I'm concerned, and stop thinking of who's good, who's bad. All of you need to contribute to the society and state that we live in and is ours. Without that, we won't move forward. But let me just tell you my own experience. I'm sure there are many others here who would agree. Fixing this problem is challenging, but entirely doable. We just have to put our minds to the right thing and let policies deliver over whatever time it takes. But we have a national security document. It does talk about this ethos, and this is a major change. And everybody agreed with that change. So please take this positive and run with it, because that's exactly where we need to go as a country. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yusuf, for your comprehensive talk. Now we will move to question and answers. Please raise your hands, introduce yourself, and focus on questions, not comments. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Abdullah Zahid and I am an intern at IRS. मेरा क्वेश्चन ये है कि नेशनल सिक्योरिटी पॉलिसी आपने बनाई, आपने बोला भी कि हम उसे पार्लियामेंट के सामने रखेंगे कंसेंसस के लिए, लेकिन उसे रखा नहीं गया और आई डोंट सी इट्स फ्यूचर इन दिस करंट गवर्नमेंट. तो मैं पूछना चाहता हूँ कि क्यों नहीं रखा गया था, उसको कंसेंसस क्यों नहीं अचीव किया गया और उस पॉलिसी का फ्यूचर क्या है. दूसरा मेरा क्वेश्चन ये है कि इस पे बड़ी एक क्रिटिसिज्म थी कि ये गोल्स तो बता रही है लेकिन स्ट्रेटजी नहीं बता रही कि उन गोल्स को अचीव कैसे करना है. तो आपका इस पे कमेंट क्या है. और तीसरी बात ये कि आप जियो इकोनॉमिक्स की बात कर रहे थे, तो आपने इंडिया के साथ ट्रेड क्यों नहीं ओपन की. अभी भी हम इंपोर्ट कर रहे हैं इंडिया से, लेकिन थ्रू यूएई ज़्यादा कॉस्ट पे. तो इसके बारे में आप क्या कहेंगे. थैंक यू.
तीनों ही बड़ा आसान सवाल. सो पहली बात पार्लियामेंट का. This policy was put in front of the National Security Committee of the Parliament, which is the body that looks at these kind of things. There is no requirement to put it in front of the Parliament. Cabinet, federal government ka cabinet jo hai wo approve karti hai policies. And National Security Committee mein, if I remember correctly, I think the then opposition boycotted. और उसका reason ना policy था ना, it was the larger picture, which frankly I didn't sort of have any vantage point to see what was happening. So yes, ideally I think, if you want to take it to the whole parliament, sure, and I think this government can do it, anybody can do it. The point is very simple. I think we shouldn't even, and I'm not opposed to it, by the way, I wasn't at that time either, but I think we shouldn't have to think about whether a policy document that makes sense to everybody has gone to this forum or that forum or whatever. If it goes, great. But if a document or if a policy, everybody agrees, makes eminent sense for the country, I mean, it's a no-brainer. Policy should be implemented according to the rules, right? So that's, I think, the way I would look at it. In terms of the future, I don't know. I'm not in government. I'm not sure how it's being dealt with now. What I can tell you is, no matter which government at what time, the direction laid out in this document is agreed by all. There is no debate left on whether we want to move in this direction or not. The challenge was to codify it, and it's been codified through a document, right? So now whether the name is used, nomenclature is different, I don't think that, inshallah, I don't think there will be a change in direction. As far as your question about trade with India is concerned, look, I mean, I've already said that it's on paper written that connectivity is a goal. But as a scholar, as somebody who's sort of moving in this direction, sound bites is not what you base your decisions on. right? You've got to look at the holistic picture, look at other national security interests, look at what would be the cost benefit politically, strategically, economically, and then make decisions, right? And in that calculus, we have so far as a state decided that it's not in our interest to move in that direction. If tomorrow that changes and there's a consensus in society, everybody wants that, I'm sure, that could be considered. तीसरा क्या था आपका सवाल? हाँ, sorry. So जो document आपने देखा है, that's a public document. There is a classified, much longer classified version of this document. In that is included a detailed implementation plan, item by item on who has to do what. It's pages and pages. And the next step of the NSP was, and I hope it's happening now as well, was to work with each department, ministry, province, whatever, to implement those identified action items. So it has a whole detailed plan. That was actually the positive thing about this policy. So it's very much there.
So my name is Basharat Khan. My question is, sir, that I would like to disagree with you on focus on geoeconomics rather than geopolitics. The point is that we are not that much well-developed country as the other countries are. So they have to focus on geoeconomics now. What we need to do, where the real problem lies in Pakistan, is geopolitics. I think we need to first set our house in order. We need to have political stability. We cannot move forward. As your words are that and then lead us towards policy. So this is what I would the
What is geoeconomics?
What's it?
What is geoeconomics?
Sir, it is something that we focus on and what we can say the economic relations, trade agreement.
So what is geopolitics?
Politics, by politics, I mean we need to say.
Well, that's not geopolitics. Yeah. So I already said that political stability, political policy continuity is a prerequisite. But geopolitics and geoeconomics are the same thing. If you're talking about, I don't want to do geoeconomics, I want to do geopolitics. So here is my question. You're saying geoeconomics is connectivity. But if you want to do geopolitics, supposedly you want to improve relations with the neighbors. So whether you improve it through connectivity or through something else is a question you have to answer. But it's the same exact thing. It's just the approach that you are taking to get to that goal. So, I've heard this a lot. A lot of people have asked me and said, तो geostrategy का क्या होगा? वही होगा जो पहले हो रहा. कोई change नहीं. You were still wanting connectivity, but the approach is very different. You're now thinking about how your economic security will be bolstered through that paradigm. That's all. But at the end of the day, आपको पहले भी connectivity करनी थी, अब भी connectivity करनी. Right? You could approach Afghanistan and say, I want to have good relations with you because of whatever, some insecurity around in the region. Or you could say, I want connectivity. Policy will be the same. It's just the mindset that you've changed on why you are approaching the problem the way you are.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yusuf, for truly an illuminating discussion. My question is that you very rightly pointed out that what we lack is the consensus of institutions. So I really want to know that how can we achieve it?
This is the question about geoeconomic diplomacy. I don't know. I've struggled with this a lot. I really don't know. It's frustrated me a lot as well because, there are models in the world that you can apply. In our case, so let me put it this way. I think systems that have crumbled and broken are easier to remold. But systems that are functional and know how to continue with their muscle memory in a path dependent way are very stubborn. It's very difficult to reorient. And I think our sort of public sector space is the latter. It functions perfectly fine. It's not, people say it's sort of broken. It's not broken at all. We've got some of the best minds working on very difficult problems and making progress, right? मैंने बहुत सुना है लोगों से, and before government, perhaps my view was also different. Bureaucracy काम नहीं करती, bureaucracy का आता कुछ नहीं. It's actually not true at all. We've got very, very smart people who know exactly what they're doing. The problem is that we are stuck in a mold where execution and implementation of ideas is good, generation of new ideas is almost non-existent. Right? So if you want to break the status quo, the first thing is that you've got to bring in the new idea that you then train people on, inculcate people with. That part is missing. And I've really struggled, but if the public sector is not going to generate those ideas themselves, if they're going to continue working in the way that they're most comfortable, if the private sector or all of you don't have a conveyor belt to take the new idea to the public sector, I'm not entirely sure how you do it. So I've really struggled, but I think maybe this is a realization that will come over time. But keep in mind, it will affect institutional turf. Some will think they're losing out. It will require new trainings. So this is a long-term process. If you want to consider a start, I think you would have to see a fundamentally different curriculum being taught at your training academies as a start to know if the system has decided to move in that direction. अगर वहां से आप शुरू कर लें तो maybe over time this will change. There are countries now who frankly merged ministries, right? There are countries I can name who don't have a separate foreign office, separate commerce, separate BOI. So countries have done it. How you get there, I really don't know at this point.
My good name is Larib Farid, and I'm a researcher at the Institute of Regional Studies. So first, you talked about the human security, and then you talked about the floods, and then you talked about one singular body that is responsible. So when we talk about the one singular body that is responsible, we move our direction towards the NDMA, that is the National Disaster Management. So if you dig deeper into that, the National Disaster Management sent out its first report on flood on 30th June. And then you see the visit of Prime Minister to the flood hit areas was on 30th July. And then you see a whole 1 month of gap in between that. My question is, and keeping in mind, of course, that was done because of the political instability going on in Pakistan. My question is that, does political instability or the political chaos or the political despair in Pakistan is so strong that it overpowers the non-traditional security threats, or it overpowers your attention towards the human security? And if the situation remains so in the political arena, does the non-traditional security of Pakistan would keep on neglecting like that? What is your assessment on that?
So, पहली चीज तो मैं आपको ये कहूंगा कि you're focusing on the wrong thing. Long-term planning and strategizing is not about when your disaster management authority puts out an assessment report after the disaster has taken place. And I was reading, somebody sent me this tweet. Maybe some of you have seen it, where I think one of the students who went abroad to get a degree in environmental sciences or something, and came back and applied to NDMA or one of these disaster management agency, maybe provincial. And the response she got was, you have gotten a degree in pre-crisis management, but we only do post-crisis management. Right? That's the issue. That's the issue. So the issue is not when the report came. And frankly, personally, if you ask me, whether the Prime Minister goes or not, that's a political decision. That's not a disaster-related decision. In any such context, those things are not important from where we are coming. What I'm saying is, who is going to plan for the next 10 years and 20 years that we overcome these kind of disasters without getting into it? So we prevent them, right? That's really the conversation we need to have. In terms of political instability overpowering, let me just say this. When we teach students, or when I was taught social science, one of the things we always teach students is be careful not to get absorbed in the moment. So rightly, everybody's talking about political instability, but what you are referring to and what somebody else referred to is 5 months old. Let's be honest. You're not talking of the 70 years. You're talking of what is happening now. But policies were the same even 10 years ago, right? So at the end of the day, let's not use this as an excuse for everything that's going wrong. I've already said that we have to make sure policy continuity is there across the spectrum. But there are certain things, certain functions that should continue regardless. And let me tell you where the problem is. We try and find solutions, almost always find solutions by centralizing decision making. And unless you can go to the grassroots level and deregulate that decision making process, I don't think you will be able to solve this long-term planning problem.
Thank you, Mohit. Salma. It's more like a comment because you have said a lot of things. And most of the things that you have said couldn't be stated better. But from where we look at the profile that you've given, most of these agencies or institutions are more like employment cells rather than production units. So how do you make these things turn? Okay, now here's this thing. The NST was made. We had NSAs previously as well. You say that regardless of the regime, the direction is there. The problem lies with the implementation, how you implement it. And then there's a framework detail that you have mentioned. Do you think your successors would follow it? They would not like to reinvent the wheel? Because this is the practice that we have been seeing all over. So how do you bridge this particular trust deficit within? Thank you.
It's a fair question. I don't know. I hope they do continue with what is there, because, I have to keep repeating this, that the work that was done there is not my work, right? I mean, it's the entire system, every single ministry, civil, military, everybody was involved. So it's as national as a document gets. Obviously, you can rightly say there wasn't enough consultation, summary, all of that is okay. But I've always maintained that it's a first draft. We've actually put in the document that anybody can come and change whatever they think they need to change. So I hope so. But for that, you have to have continuity even of the office. So I mean, it is what it is. But again, I think this question of change, and frankly, Nadeem Saab, Azad Saab, Khalid is sitting here, they will be better placed to answer this. But I don't see the public sector wanting to change from within. I just don't see that appetite. And why should there be appetite, right? If you're an individual who's at a position for 6 months or a year or 2 years, you've been taught something your entire life, that's how you will process it, right? Maybe my training is to be the bull in the china shop, to bring out new ideas, think differently, and maybe I rely too much on that, right? Maybe I should do less. So I don't see that appetite. If not, then the only other thing I can think of, apart from, leadership and all of that is fine, but the only other thing I can think of is that you have enough of a critical mass in terms of numbers and quality of private sector professionals who come into the public sector and essentially act as change agents. It doesn't mean they'll do what is needed and they'll get it right every time. But I think the first challenge is to break the status quo in some ways, right? I will tell you personally, my 2.5 years in office was a fairly lonely experience because there was not a critical mass around who I could speak my language with and say, okay, how do we work together to convince our bosses that here is a direction that won't bother the current system, but we can open up new opportunities, right? I will also tell you that I personally think people like me have to change their attitude and their mindset. Because a lot of us, first of all, don't want to go into government. कि नहीं यार, ये तो गंदा काम. How is it ganda? I mean, that's where change comes. And I was very reluctant, by the way, right? I'm saying this now, 2.5 years ago, people who know how I went in, and maybe you're one of them, I had a different view. But the other problem I find is that our attitude is that we are doing the system a favor by taking a pay cut and giving time to this, corroding environment. Actually, there can be no more privilege than having an opportunity to serve at such levels, whether it's high or low, doesn't matter, and making a difference. So, and the reason I say that is that if you go with the former attitude, what happens is that within 2 months or 3 months, you are stonewalled, you get stuck, and then you say, this is all useless, I'm leaving. And what happens after that is that the 10 people who are going to join government look at your experience and say, yaar, main to nahi jata, dekho iske sath kya hua. I think we've got to change that. We've got to be more humble. We've got to realize that we are coming into a system which is not of our liking, but whatever we can contribute, we have to, right? So wahan bhi change ki zarurat hai. And of course, public sector has to loosen up and agree that status quo is not tenable anymore.
It's not a question, just an observation. We all know that political instability of the country has damaged our long-term economic planning and policies. Dr. Ishrat Hussain argues that even in countries like Japan, Italy, Netherlands, where political instability exists, their economies function because they have strong institutions. He also cites the example of 60s era of Pakistan. And this is probably true to an extent because the institutions today, the public sector institutions, are simply not interested to take risks and initiatives. Classic example is the floods that we are going through. तमाम think tanks ने अपने अपने events में किए हैं, हमने भी बड़े किए हैं, and honestly I was pleasantly surprised to see such an reservoir of expertise. Geologist हैं, environmentalist हैं, बड़ा knowledge है, वो आपको बड़े अच्छे तरीके से explain करते हैं. Lekin it has always been struggle for me to get anybody from NDMA to participate in any of those discussions, or anybody from Ministry of Climate Change to participate in those discussions. Nor have I seen those institutions take any initiative to invite such experts and sort of open the way of that there could be new ways of doing things. Ye jo gap hai between the policy implementers and the new ideas being generated in academia and think tanks, ye bahut वाइड है. अब बहुत इंस्टीट्यूशंस बन गए हैं, हम लोग भी कर रहे हैं काम, लेकिन वो हो नहीं रहा. हमने पाकिस्तान की तजारत के ऊपर इतने प्रोग्राम किए हैं, लेकिन कभी हम कॉमर्स मिनिस्ट्री से बंदा नहीं ला सकते यहाँ पे. देयर इज एब्सोल्युटली नो वे, नहीं करते. इवन कॉमर्स मिनिस्ट्री का क्रिटिसिज्म आ रहा है, लेकिन आई प्रोबब्ली हैव टू से दैट कि इवन जब वो चाइना के साथ एफटीए करते हैं या इंडिया के साथ जब तजारत की करते हैं, दे आर सपोज्ड टू कंसल्ट द स्टेक होल्डर्स लाइक इंडस्ट्री एंड ट्रेडर्स, और वो नाम का करते हैं जी हमने टिक मार्क कर दिया. अब इस गैप को फिल करना ऑनेस्टली बहुत मुश्किल है. देयर आर इंडिविजुअल्स विद इन द पॉलिटिकल लीडरशिप जो शायद करते हैं, कोशिश करते हैं, बट वास्ट मेजॉरिटी shun the new ideas lest it takes away their space. It's just an observation.
Also, can I react, because this is, as you know, we tried very hard आपके साथ मिलके and others, but जो puzzle मेरे ज़हन में है, what is the cost for the system, जो भी system हो, वो department हो या NSD हो मेरे case पे, whatever, what is the cost for the system to continue those processes? एक तो है ना नई चीज लानी, चले आपने कहा जी मैंने नहीं लाना या मैंने नहीं सोचा या मैंने नहीं करना, एक चीज है, राइट? वी क्रिएटेड अ कन्वेयर बेल्ट, लेट्स थिंक टैंक्स को, यूनिवर्सिटीज को लिंक किया, जैसा भी है, अच्छा है बुरा है, आइडिया क्या था? न्यू आइडियाज, चैलेंज अस, टेल अस व्हाट टू डू. Why do those things basically stop when the person leaves? Because there's no cost to continuing. एक प्रोसेस तो चल रहा है ना, आपको इनपुट आ रही है, चले आप ये कह सकते हैं जी चैनल नहीं हो रही, इनपुट whatever, बट प्रोसेस तो चल रहा है, कॉन्वर्सेशन भी हो रही है. But I think we are not even at that point where we want to make the effort to continue processes that may be there, and that to me is inexplainable, but frankly criminal in some ways. दूसरा पॉइंट में, I'll leave this question to you and to others who've been in the system. I will never forget this sentence, which was very early on in my government time, which told me where the problem was. There was some conversation, koi policy ki discussion ho rahi thi. And at one point, there was a disagreement, and somebody very senior said ke, sir, aap jo baat kare wo to theek hai, लेकिन देखिए मेरा काम तो मेरे इदारे को डिफेंड कर. एंड आई काइंड ऑफ लुक्ड एट हिम एंड आई सेड, सो व्हाट यू आर टेलिंग मी इज कि जो मैं कह रहा हूं वो पाकिस्तान के लिए बेहतर है, लेकिन यू हैव टू डिफेंड योर टर्फ. हियर इज वेयर द प्रॉब्लम. आप किस तरह सिनर्जीज डेवलप करेंगे, आप किस तरह कोऑर्डिनेट करेंगे, आप किस तरह बात करेंगे, जब इंस्टीट्यूशनल ईथोस ट्रेनिंग की पब्लिक सेक्टर अक्रॉस द बोर्ड ये है कि यार मेरी ये मिनिस्ट्री है, मेरा ये डिपार्टमेंट है, मेरा ये इदारा है, मेरा काम इसको पुश करना. देन वी आर रियली स्ट्रगलिंग, बिकॉज आज की दुनिया में कोई पॉलिसी ऐसी नहीं है जो एक इदारा बाय देमसेल्व्स, कोई मिनिस्ट्री वो काम कर लेगी और बाकियों की जरूरत नहीं पड़ेगी. इट्स जस्ट नॉट पॉसिबल एनीमोर, राइट? इट्स अ नेटवर्क्ड वर्ल्ड. दैट माइंडसेट आई डोंट नो how to change, because if that doesn't change, status quo will never break. Sure.
So since we're running out of time, we have time for a few more questions.
Thank you. Thank you for this very somber reflection. My name is Khalid Banoori, formerly in the government. We've, a brief comment on, this policy itself and the initiative to write this policy down and bring it out in the open. Lots of times such policies were written down, but then they were kept in close quarters. Now that this has happened, so in one thing, I think you've been successful that the conversations have started on this. The problem is it won't be sustainable unless there is a significant or a cautious effort to continue with these conversations. The think tanks have done, I'll give this example of several sessions. Those sessions need to go to a culmination of, so, all right, so this is what our assessment is, how do we actually go ahead and do it? And then, as he said, stakeholders coming in or not. So this challenge will remain with you. But let me just put one nuts and bolts strand out of the things, because I'm looking at it in this thing, this political stability is not going to come back tomorrow. We are where we are, and we have to continue with what we do. So within all these constraints, one little strand, we need, in order to have development, and in order to have development so that you could have better exports and so on and so forth, you need to have access to cheap energy, not only energy, but cheap energy, which means less per unit cost. Now, there are lots of conversations about it. There are some efforts, they aren't really there. My question specifically in this context would be, would it not be better to choose the cocoons that, some of them, that actually are good for exports, providing more priority, and you did talk about prioritization, priority to cities like Faisalabad and Sialkot and Karachi, regardless of what the provincial positions are, so that some aspects of those achievements start to happen, which could, and at least in theory, reduce the stress. Several governments, starting from Ayub Khan and your government also had this notion, which was a good idea about human security. घर घर बिजली पहुंचाने का. घर घर बिजली आप कल तो नहीं पहुंचा सकते. If you actually focus it this way, perhaps better exports can actually start to come in shorter time. Are there any reactions to that? Thank you.
देखिए जो I mean you've got a fair point. जो बात मैं कर रहा हूँ ये 100 billion 65 से, this is going to be a very elaborate policy backed by a strategy, right? इसमें multiple angles हैं, आपने sectors identify करने, उन sectors को क्या चाहिए, कितनी देर में वो क्या deliver कर सकते हैं, उसमें फैसलाबाद ज़्यादा important है या कराची ज़्यादा important है या whatever. All of this, right? है problem ये है कि you've got sectoral policies which are overarching, right? अगर आपने trade policy की बात की, दुनिया की हर चीज हमने बेचनी है, बनाते भी नहीं है लेकिन वो बेचनी जरूर, और जो पिछली दफा बेची थी उससे 5% ज्यादा बेचनी, कैसे बेचनी है देख लेंगे, सोचेंगे, करेंगे, राइट? जब आप प्राइवेट सेक्टर से बात करते हैं, दे आर इन अ डिफरेंट वर्ल्ड, और जो हम पब्लिक सेक्टर में बात करते हैं वो टोटली फर्क, राइट? सो एनर्जी, यस एब्सोल्युटली, वो एनर्जी पॉलिसी डवटेल होनी है विद द रिक्वायरमेंट्स ऑफ योर प्रोडक्शन, राइट? ये सारा काम तो हर मतलब पब्लिक सेक्टर में, अभी क्वेश्चन ये है कि क्या आप उन 3-4 चीजों पे फोकस कर सकते हैं जो आपको ये डिलीवर करके देंगे. Doesn't mean कि बाकी चीजें आप छोड़, I want to be clear, but we have to find out ways where we can promote that space and build, right? मैं अभी IT वाले किसी से बात कर रहा था, and they said कि जी इतनी potential, मैंने कहा फिर करते क्यों नहीं? उन्होंने कहा जी इसलिए नहीं करते कि जो 90% IT experts आप प्रोड्यूस, वो ग्रेजुएट्स प्रोड्यूस कर रहे हैं वो एम्प्लॉयबल ही नहीं. So आप ह्यूमन रिसोर्स हमें ठीक दे दें and we'll write it down for you in writing कि इतनी देर में आपके इतने हम रेवेन्यू बढ़ा दें. So those are things that we have to focus on.
Also, if I could please request everyone to keep the questions concise so we can fit more in. We have the last 5 minutes and then we have to wrap up. Thank you.
Mohit Saab, my name is Shah Jamal. It's always pleasure listening to you. You're a very bright person. But I have issue with the notion national security. If I start to look at everything through the nozzle of national security, then automatically people have apprehensions, people have issues. We should have a document called National Vision 2050,
Sure.
2030, or whatever.
Sure.
Because the way I see it, NDU had a policy pushed into NDU in 2012 and 13, national security policy started there. And then subsequently, it keep going to the Prime Minister's Secretariat again and again. But even person like Fawad Hassan Fawad kept it in his desk, didn't get it out because there are serious apprehensions. Everything cannot be seen through the prism of national security. Everything has to be seen through the prism as to what Pakistan wants. And foreign policy and all other policy cannot be part of the national security policy. Basically, these are independent policies. Yes, few ASEAN countries within their own, they don't have challenges like challenges that we have. What I want to say is, sir, you need to promote. We also had a document, not that very good document, but we can work in the future because country, you said very easily that if we have 100 million more, 100 billion more, pie would be bigger and thing would be. A country which doesn't have export surplus, how can we think? We have to think in the present and how to resolve. Your national security policy was out of the window the minute these crises developed in Pakistan. People were not willing to sit and talk. Your national security division just evaporated. I would just like to have you. Thank you.
So I couldn't disagree more actually. And let me say why. This is not the constitution of Pakistan or the national vision of Pakistan. It is not talking about the economy of Pakistan. It is talking about that part of the economy that matters to national security. How? We are talking of exports not because I want to develop the economy. Of course, I want to develop the economy, but there are others whose job this is. We had to figure out that you have resentment towards the state, violence, in some cases, insurgencies in certain areas of Pakistan. What is fueling that? You work backwards from there and you realize, among other things, one of the issues is distribution, right? So then you start addressing, you must address this distribution problem or injudicious distribution problem if you want security. That's a national security issue. This is not an economy issue. But how do you get that resource to distribute? Then becomes a question that we have to answer. It would be wishy-washy, it would be pie in the sky if we didn't then explain how we are saying you need to get there. That's one. Second, we argue, or what we argue, I mean, this is the entire system that sort of decided, that we have to move towards development partnerships, not aid diplomacy. Why? Because your foreign policy can never be independent if all you are doing is aid diplomacy all the time, right? This is a conversation we keep having colloquially in this country. That's a national security issue. Because if you don't have foreign policy independence, then you will make compromises with other countries just to survive. And by the way, we've been doing that for the past 70 years. So this document is not talking about the economy. It's not talking about how to fix hospitals and how many beds hospitals should have. It is only talking about those elements that directly affect national security. So ek to ye cheez. The other thing is everything is not security, nor should it be. And the people who are not concerned with security should not talk about security. You're absolutely right. And this document in no way stops people from doing that. In terms of this idea of NSD evaporating out of the window, that's not a policy or a no policy question. That's a decision that the system has to make, right? I mean, today, if you decide that you're not going to have secretaries and ministers in 10 ministries, work will stop. So this is not a policy question. This is a decision that somebody has to make. And yes, continuity in office, continuity in policy is critical.
I'm sorry, we have time for one last question, and this gentleman's been waiting for a very long time.
Thank you very much. So nice of you. Faisal Raza Khan, I'm the senior correspondent covering defense and foreign affairs, along with I'm part of a think tank as well. Thank you very much, Dr. Moeed. You were always very much accommodative when you were there in NSD, but right now we are just locating that entity. So my question, or that is pinpointed related to the national security. Unfortunately, a country in which dissenting voices has no space, and mostly those are called a breach to the national security or might be the threat to that. Then academia industry linkage, I club it with public sector as well. Academia industry public sector linkage is missing. Then there is, unfortunately, we are not focusing on entrepreneurship or the ideas related to innovation, creativity, and research right from schools. I'm not talking about the higher education or something like that. I'm pointing out at schools because we are not using those brains who are in making. And those could be the high-class entrepreneurs, those could be the policymakers or scientists or doctors or something like that. So when such type of dilemma is there, how could be that the national security policy, a great document which was envisaged, that going to be the success in future? Thank you, sir.
So kabhi nahi kaha it will be the success of the future. I keep repeating to everybody, there was a decision made well before I came into office, a right decision, that we need to codify what our conception of this concept is, which is, by the way, a very divisive concept in Pakistan. We've had debate over this concept for our entire existence. So anybody can change whatever they want, take it wherever they want. The broad direction is laid out in front of everybody, right? I don't think one should be fixated on a document's success. I am much more focused on continuity of that vision, that idea that supposedly everybody thinks is in the right direction. I'll say this for any policy. I mean, I think it's very dangerous for a system to associate a document with a person or an institution, because then it won't have longevity. your larger comment, frankly, my brain is not big enough to absorb these big problems. I think when we talk about these big problems, actually it's the best way to say बहुत मसाइल हैं कुछ भी नहीं हो सकता. I'm much more interested in identifying specific things to do, creating action plans and implementing. And if everybody is doing that in their lane, chances are that you'll get much more done, right? So I think that's the approach that I would take to these problems. We're a large country, we're a very diverse country. You know, it's not as simple as that. मैंने तो कम से कम यही देखा है कि अगर आप कोई चीज भी कहें तो पब्लिक सेक्टर में उस पे कोई ना कोई प्रोग्राम, कोई ना कोई इनिशिएटिव या हो चुका होगा या हो रहा होगा या करने वाले होंगे. There's virtually nothing that has not been tried or done. क्वालिटी हो सकती है, रिसोर्स हो सकते हैं, इम्प्लीमेंट करने का तरीका हो सकता है. So I think we need to work more on that, but unless we can prioritize and know what are the key areas where, you know, the most important people of the country have to spend time, we end up doing too much and the result is nothing. So I think to me, that's a better approach.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Yusuf, for your talk, as well as staying on longer to answer the questions. I would now request President IRS, Ambassador Nadeem Riaz, to please hand the souvenir over to our speaker, and then we will break for tea, and then you can continue the conversation at tea if you would like to. Thank you so much.